FT podcast.
Well, this is all we talk. Yeah, this is this is all we talk about. As tax nerds is the incredibly disappointing.
Okay, we're live, so save that. Welcome all of you to this latest lunch hour, which brings together our esteemed economics panel, who will explain to you everything you wanted to know and probably some more things to boot about yesterday's budget. We're joined by Jonathan Portes from King's, Jill Rutter and Gemma Tetlow, both from the Institute for Government, though Jill has split loyalties, don't you, Jill? And Ben Chu from the BBC. So as ever, let me start you off with a sort of softball starter for 10. Just quickly, what are your key takeaways, your key impressions of the budget yesterday? We might as well go in that order. So, Jonathan.
On the plus side, I think the Chancellor has done a reasonably good job of doing what was necessary to get us, on a sort of more moderately sensible fiscal track. She's filled the fiscal hole in ways which won't be too painful politically, or shouldn't be, and which don't hit the economy in the short term because the significant tax rises are backloaded. And I don't think it would have been appropriate from a macro perspective to have significant tax increases kicking in now. The other good thing is that this does genuinely help those on lower incomes, especially poor families with children. The 2-child limit was one of the worst social policy decisions ever made by a British government. And its abolition is going to improve the lives of millions of kids. And we're talking literally about families who could not afford to feed their kids properly or to heat their houses properly, who will be able to do so because of this. And frankly, I'm prepared to give up my salary sacrifice scheme and some other things at the top end in order to fund that. So that's the good point. Negative points, however, there's no serious attempt at growth enhancing tax reform. And I think that's quite disappointing. If you're going to address the regressive nature of council tax, for God's sake, do it properly. Instead, we've got the so-called mansion tax just makes the system even more complicated and less economically efficient. And the big one from a macro perspective, although I think the macro stance is probably appropriate, it's still very vulnerable to risks, both domestic and international. And we've seen the markets have reacted reasonably positively in the short term. But you'd have to be, I think, quite brave to bet on that holding up if we get a significant adverse shock. And we know, sadly, from experience, that those are quite likely.
Thank you very much. Gemma?
So I think if you looking at yesterday's announcements, the big picture was actually pretty small forecast downgrade. And what the Chancellor did was another significant tax rise to pay for building up more headroom against the fiscal rules, which is definitely a good, prudent thing to do and should make fiscal policy more stable. And some giveaways to areas that this government thinks are important, things like the child benefit cap and reversing some of the previous plans on welfare cuts. I think the thing that baffles me is quite what was going on with the weeks of speculation in the run-up to the budget that meant that people were expecting a totally different story of horrifically bad economic forecasts and the government being forced to do huge tax rises just to address that. And I think somehow the positive news of more prudence on the fiscal rules and giveaways in areas that this government obviously prioritise sort of got a bit lost in that whole story.
Interesting. Jill?
I think building on what Gemma and Jonathan have said, I think the really interesting thing is the picture the government seems to want to be building for the end of the decade, with really quite tight spending to come, and also a lot of new taxes coming in, and old change keeping on. And the OBR is telling them that it's going to be a very grim story on living standards for the rest of the decade. Now, I'm sure Rachel Reeves, she made quite a big play yesterday, I thought, of how much better the economy had done this year than the OBR had forecast originally, that they said sort of 1%, they'd revised up to 1.5%. The OBR has just time shifted that around. So it basically says the economy is no bigger in real terms at the end of the decade than they were originally saying. But I think she's pinning quite a lot on some of the upsides materializing, so she won't actually have to confront, she or her successor chancellor won't quite have to confront the sort of grim picture that she's locking herself into on current projections for the back end of the decade. So it's very interesting that the spending, the cost of living reliefs and all of those come in very early. Very interesting question on things like some of the price freeze and things, do those become as baked in as the fuel duty freeze has become? Can we start raising rail fares again? Things like that. So I think that's really quite interesting. How differs that's obviously a permanent loss unless you catch it back up. So really interesting to see, what decision she's kicked down, and some really interesting consultations to come on the design of some of these new taxes. I was out at dinner last night with people who live near me, so they were all debating how to knock down the value of their homes to get below the 2 million threshold, and others were talking about ways of evading the mileage charge on their Teslas, and I think that's going to be slightly odd circles, but I think the designs of those taxes are quite interesting. It's very interesting, the high uncertainty rating that the OBR is giving to quite a lot of the measures on which she's depending, which is one of the consequences of going for lots of little tax tweaks as opposed to fill in quite a lot of the gap, as opposed to just taking it all out with one very big move. She's obviously done one quite big move on thresholds, which you can probably pretty much bank, but the others look quite difficult to forecast behaviourally.
I'm quite curious to know how HMRC are going to know how many miles you've done. But anyway, Ben.
Thanks. So I think coming into this budget, we were all expecting not to be surprised because there'd been so much pre-briefing about big tax rises coming. I think we were actually, or at least I was a little bit surprised on the day by how much the fiscal position had not deteriorated in a way that a lot of the analysis before it had led us to believe. That the hole that she needed to fill to get back to pre budget headroom was not as big as expected. It was, in fact, she was still in a surplus in the 2029-30. I don't think many of us expected that. And then for her to have still nevertheless raised taxes by about £26 billion in the target year to get that headroom back up to not a great level, but a more respectable level of £20 billion was a positive thing, because I think so much of the angst and confusion around budgetary policy in recent years has been driven by that lack of headroom. There's been a lot of stuff talked about, is the OBR running the show? But it's all about she left herself so little headroom that it was inevitably going to create this speculation about tax rises. So I'm hopeful, although it would probably be better if it was higher, that the fact that it's, as I said, at a respectable level will take some of that angst out of it in future. We'll wait and see. So credit to her for that. Credit which something she didn't necessarily need to do, but she's done it, and she's taken the political pain of announcing those tax rises, albeit that they are backdated. What's less creditworthy, what's a bit more depressing, as others have said, is the fact that she's rebuilt that headroom of taxes, which are little taxes. The smorgasbord approach, the word we've all been talking about, but it is true. Doing it that way really doesn't reform the system on the whole, and it is more vulnerable to uncertainty and reversals, which we'll probably come on to talk about. And just a final thought, just really for a government which still insists that its priority, its number one overriding priority is growth, don't think they would have rebuilt the headroom in the way that they have if that really was true. There's a bit of a gap, a bigger gap opening up between the rhetoric and the reality of this government when it comes to growth, I think.
Interesting, thank you. I promise you, because it's the sort of thing you four like talking about, we will come back to tax reform at a certain point, but not quite yet. I mean, as we've got an IFG heavy panel, let's start with process, because of course the IFG, amongst others, has long called for a sort of single fiscal event every year, and you've got it. The thing is, it's a fiscal event that seemed to have lasted half of the year, which presumably isn't what you'd had in mind. So, I mean, Jill and Gemma, if you could just reflect on the process that we've just witnessed, which strikes me as, to put it politely, far from optimal. Go
Yes,
on, Jill.
I mean,
Emma.
have to start.
Cool.
Jill can pitch in. I mean, just on your reference to a single fiscal event, just for the viewers who may not have been paying such close attention to Reeves's speech yesterday, one of the things she said was that she will now only judge her performance against the fiscal rules once a year rather than twice a year at each of the economic forecasts. We think this is a good move. It's definitely, the UK is really unusual in having 2 substantive fiscal events a year. Pretty much all other countries only do tax measures and significant spending once a year. So that's great. I think my question is, we're still going to be in a world where the OBR produces a new forecast. So is Rachel Reeves or whoever's chancellor going to be able to resist the temptation? You're going to have the OBR forecast there, even if the chancellor doesn't formally assess the rules themselves. You don't need to be an economics graduate to look at the numbers and work out for yourself whether the government is still meeting or not its fiscal rules. So I think the real test of this is going to come when we get a downgrade in the forecast. The OBR forecast suggests the government's off track on its rules. Is the chancellor actually going to be able to stand up on that day and say, we understand, we'll come back at the budget and do something if it's still needed then, but we're not going to succumb to the pressure right now to do something immediately? I think that will be the test. Hopefully they can do that, but it's only if that's possible that you really get into a world of a single fiscal event.
Just one question on that specifically, Gemma, if I can, which is, would that have an impact on markets if, say, the OBR downgraded the forecast, the chancellor didn't do anything, because we do this once a year now? Would the markets, is there a possibility at least that this would move the markets?
I think it's definitely possible, and Ben may have more insight on this as well. So I think there is a case that we would make that says, actually, for the long-term fiscal sustainability of the country, and that's really what markets should care about, what you want is for governments to make well thought through, sustainable policies rather than rushing out measures concocted over a few weeks in response to every single movement in the economic forecast. And I think you saw in spring this year the problem when governments do try and react quickly to forecast downgrades with their disability and incapacity benefit reforms. They rushed those out very quickly and then they fell apart. So although on the day it looked like they'd done something that meant they were back on track with their fiscal rules again, in theory that reassured markets that they were serious about fiscal sustainability, but actually it very quickly fell apart and it was policy that wasn't sustainable. So I think the pitch we would make is it's better for a chancellor to take a bit of extra time through to the following budget, develop some policies that really will stick and deal with the problem once a year. And markets should be, I guess the question for markets is, can they be sufficiently reassured in that intervening period that they believe the chancellor is going to take the tough decisions needed in the next fiscal event, not worry about where things are going in the meantime.
I'm just building on what Gemma says. Gemma's obviously right that, what we saw in March was very unedifying. We saw the government rushing into a package, grafting some very big savings onto a package that's supposed to be a reform package, and basically in doing so not only failed to deliver the savings because the backbenchers said no, but also set back the cause of wider reform as well by sort of tainting it with that, and now it's all being pushed into a review, whatever. So I mean, that was just frankly bad all round. It's bad for the government's credibility, it's bad for authority, it was bad for actually the policy area that they decided to lock the savings into. I think what you would need is a government with sufficient credibility to be able to say, well, if the numbers are still like this in the autumn, then obviously we will take the necessary measures to do that. The bit that I think is still missing is another IFG recommendation, one that we shared with the IFS and the Chartered Institute of Taxation when we did our Better Budgets report back in 2017, and which we've been banging on about ever since, is that we still don't have any clear sense of tax strategy from Rachel Reeves. And one of the things I think that was really, really bad about this budget was how things came into view and then disappeared again. And that has some real world effects. We've had the sort of, complaint that the general seesawing around the budget dimmed business confidence more generally, but also the rumours that we were about to impose an exit tax for capital gains came and went, and we got stories that people were moving assets offshore. Last year, we had rumours to how the government was going to treat pensions. It led to people crystallising lump sums, then looking at whether they could decrystallise it, whatever the reverse of crystallisation is. So I think the government actually, in some of these key areas where you basically want some long run predictability, it would really help if we had some clear view of what Rachel Reeves thought the right structures for some of these taxes were. She's given us a bit on the corporate side, but not much else. And it's not at all clear from this budget whether she has any tax principles beyond what I think I can get away with politically.
Okay, I can see you're all straining at the leash, but we will get to tax reform later, I promise. I mean,
I'll just make a point about the markets, Anand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, just two quick points. It's really, really difficult to judge what moves the market, before it actually happens. I've been looking at them a long time, and I can't see it really. You can make a story up, but it's not necessarily a very coherent story. And the second point is the question of whether moving to a single fiscal event would move the markets in an adverse way if there was a deterioration in the spring statement or not, really does come back to this issue of the headroom. Because if she's got a decent amount of headroom and she can absorb any adverse movement that's projected by the OBR, then the markets aren't going to freak out that, because that's what the headroom is for, is to absorb that. So the market reaction will depend on how much headroom she's given herself against her own rules. I think that's important to bear in mind.
I'm not sure that the headroom is what matters as opposed to the broader fiscal picture. And I think I agree with Gemma on this. I mean, frankly, who cares what the OBR forecasts in terms of economic growth? They don't know any better than NISA or Goldman Sachs. Maybe sometimes they're closer. They do know a bit better what future tax revenues will be like, because they have access to a lot of inside information that NISA or Goldman Sachs doesn't have. But I think that's pretty second order. And in terms of, Ben's right, of course, it's very difficult to predict what the markets will do. But I did say, back in the early 2010s, when there was a lot of talk about the rating agencies and the UK government, I said, anybody who thinks that the rating agencies have anything useful to say about the fiscal credibility of the UK government that we don't already know is talking nonsense. And I would not expect rating agency changes to make any difference to how markets perceive UK government debt. And that was absolutely right? They didn't. So I always say that, markets are not rational exactly, but it's hard, in my view, to make the view that they're systematically irrational in a way that we can say anything terribly useful about. So while you can't predict it, my sort of central expectation is that, to the extent that OBR forecasts don't really in the intervene, won't in themselves really contain any new information, that they won't move markets much. What will move markets much is what would be new information, which is the government response to an OBR forecast. So if the government responds by saying, yes, of course, we're going to stick to our fiscal rules like we've always said, then markets will probably shrug if it's vaguely credible. If governments respond by saying, oh dear, there's a big hole, we'll deal with that when we come to it, but don't worry your pretty little heads about it, then markets might well get a bit more worried for good reason.
Okay, just finally on the process, I mean, I wonder whether one fiscal event just means longer speculation, because I mean the speculation around this budget has been ridiculous. I mean, it's been going on for months, and you've had all these rumours and counter rumours. I saw Lewis Goodall on social media arguing that actually leaks are quite a good thing, because they prepare people for what's coming, and it means you don't have a shock like you had with the Liz Truss budget. Though I think there were other aspects about that caused the shock. I mean, how do you get that balance right between having this series of leaks and counter leaks, some of which are true, some of which aren't, and that must have an impact on economic behaviour, all that uncertainty. I mean, how do you get that right? And I presume you agree that this wasn't done as well as it could have been.
I think this budget was unusual in quite how much. Who knows whether they were active pitch rolling stories coming from the Treasury or other people putting ideas out there. There was like a very long period and a huge range of policy measures that got mooted at one point or another. So I think it's been unusual, but it's not. It's kind of maybe got a scaled up version of what we typically get in front of budgets. But I think I'd agree with Jill's point that if we had a clearer idea of what the government's strategy on tax was, it would be much less likely, it would be much clearer what things might be on the table when the government was looking for tax rises. If we knew there were particular areas of the tax system that the government thought could be improved, then those would be the focus of the debate rather than other areas. I think also we often we're so used to the way that we make budgets in this country, but we often lose sight of the fact that it's such a different process to how we deal with other types of policy areas where we would actually have an open discussion and consultation on policy proposals, discuss the merits of change, the options for change, and then you come to a conclusion. And you could do much more of that on tax. And we don't do that. I think that would really help to get away from the huge level of uncertainty that we've had in the run up to this budget and others.
You see how you're doing it again? You're trying to edge me towards this conversation about tax reform. And I'm going to resist for the moment, because before we get on to that, I mean, I just want to talk about one other thing, which is growth. I mean, in its first year and in opposition, the Labour Party majored on this aspect that growth is our absolute priority. Growth is our number one priority. Leaving aside the issue of tax reform and just looking at this budget, it seems to me that growth was slightly relegated as a priority. I don't know whether you think that's fair or not. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair, because you should take it together with the package of investments unveiled in last year's budget, and that's part of the growth strategy. So you should see it as a whole. But would I be right in saying that actually growth was a bit of a missing element in this budget? Jonathan, you're primed and ready.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that, as I said, the sort of positive aspect of both the nature and timing of the tax increases was that they probably won't have a big negative impact on growth. But the negative is that there's no sign of a growth strategy either in the tax reform or more broadly, was there much of a follow-up? And here, we have a government that's announced some things that I think most economists think would be positive for growth on planning reform, infrastructure. There's a new nuclear power review that came out yesterday, housing and so on. But so far, rather little of that has been delivered. And it's pretty depressing that a government that quite rightly is committed to a significant step up in house building has seen a significant step down, and doesn't as yet seem to have sort of got its head around how you get the machine to actually deliver the increase that they say they want. And then even worse than that is that the government is doing some things which almost certainly will be negative for growth. Most obviously, the restrictions on migration, and by that I mean regular migration for work and study, where today's figures already show a considerable, that migration is running at levels considerate for legal migration for people who come here to work and study is running at levels considerably below that assumed by the OBR in their publication just yesterday. And that in turn has a pretty direct impact on the size of the labor force, the size of the economy, and hence the overall fiscal aggregates. So you've got a government that, for political reasons, which I do not fully understand, is clamping down on, not on small boats as the separate and less economically relevant issue, but clamping down on migration for work and study in a way which is certainly going to have negative impacts for growth. I'd also note, just to talk our own book here a bit, that it also seems to be sleepwalking into a major car crash in the university sector. And while I don't think public money is necessarily the answer to that, the fact is that the university sector is one of the UK's most productive and biggest export sectors, as well as having some pretty major spillover benefits for the economy more widely. And crashing that is not going to be growth enhancing either.
Anyone else want to comment on this issue of growth?
I thought it was quite interesting that Rachel Reeves, set out her 3 priorities for the budget, and those were cutting NHS waiting lists. Well, actually, she did virtually nothing in the budget. I mean, she could point to what she did in the spending review, but the actual NHS announcement associated with the budget was pretty minuscule about some neighbourhood health centres, and not quite clear the timetable on that. Cutting the cost of living, where she did some actions on administered prices where she could, which scored the biggest ever reduction in inflation from that source next year, but obviously potentially unwinds later on. And cutting the national debt. I do think she, is hoping that, I think she really, really does want to get debt service costs down. I think that's one of her very big priorities. I think she rightly identifies that as a sort of genuine waste of money, where you could be spending debt service on tax cuts or on public services, public spending, welfare, whatever, but the worst possible use of it is in debt service. And that's why some people, I think, thought she might go for even more headroom to try and accelerate the Bank of England's interest rate reduction. So the sort of good news on the sort of stickier inflation is probably bad news on that. But she didn't even seem to sort of make that much of, we put out the modern industrial strategy, things like that, and go back to lots of that. She could have done more to talk up what she's doing on capital. And when I went and talked to a business audience this morning, the thing that they quite welcome some of the changes on apprenticeships, particularly for SMEs, but they were all very worried about the impact of the budget announcement, the eve of budget announcement on the national minimum, national living wage, and about the employment rights bills, which they both, say are deterring people from taking on employees, particularly younger ones, entering the labour market.
Gemma or Ben, anything on this issue of growth?
Well, I've already said, there's a bit of a gap opening up, as people have said, between the rhetoric and the reality on growth when it comes to policy. I mean, if you were being unkind or cynical, you could say this is a bit of a panicked budget in some ways, in the sense that she's trying to shore up her base in her parliament with the lifting the the 2-child benefit cap and focusing on inflation, the cost of living, trying to show people tangible impacts on their living costs in the near future. Whereas these are all kind of relatively more short-term things, whereas the longer hard medicine that will get you growth is obviously further out. But I think you're right, Anand, to frame it in the context of the things that they've done overall over this parliament. And, many economists would say it's not enough, but sustaining, or at least not imposing those capital investment cuts that she inherited, that were penciled in from the previous government, is definitely a positive thing. And I think Rachel Reeves is right that it would have been relatively easy for her to say, oh, well, we're just going to scrap that, as previous governments have done, and fill the hole in the public finances, or increase public spending on current spending by reducing that. So I think it's legitimate for them to say, overall, over all the decisions they've made over this parliament, they are more focused on growth than others. I think that's in their defence.
Okay. Gemma, did you want to? Okay, just to say, with regard to what Jonathan was saying about planning, we did a report, the Resolution Foundation, last September, and there's a section in it by Paul Cheshire of the LSE on planning reforms and house building, which is really worth reading. And it's quite coruscating about what the government has failed to do in terms of planning reform so far. It's a really interesting read. Okay, I'm going to let you off the lead.
Anand, I just want to come in. There's one. I was just reading the start of the Red Book, which is the Treasury's sort of description of its measures. And it's very weird on growth. It claims credit for building 170,000 more houses by 2029-30. And say, well, sure, but they're not actually being built at the moment. You can't claim credit for things that aren't yet happening. In the same way, they claim credit for their EU trade deal, which, the OBR said, well, we're not scoring anything from that because actually it's not agreed and you haven't got any details. And there is a bit of a problem with this government that it thinks if it says it, they will come, that, it's enough to say we want all these houses for them to appear. And I think that's a rhetoric action gap is something that they really, really need to close in the next year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I noticed in the speech that she said we've got a brand new trade deal with the European Union, which struck me as a bit of an oversell of what happened at the summit. We will touch on Brexit at some point because the Lib Dems have been talking about that quite a lot in the context of this budget. But now, just for a couple of minutes, then, you've all in one way or another hinted at this issue of tax reform. And it is noticeable that of all the strategies governments have, I can't recall a government ever having a tax strategy for how to make our sort of tax system more rational, clearer, less regressive, and so on. So what could and should she have done? Actually, I should say, though it grieves me to promote another podcast, that Stuart Wood from the House of Lords was talking about this on the IFG podcast. Yes, was it yesterday it came out? I listened to it this morning.
Last week.
Oh, was that? Oh, bloody hell. Okay, I am behind the times. What could and should she have done in the way of tax reform that would have met with your approval, do you think? And where did she go wrong in terms of this budget? Don't all shout at once.
I'm happy to have a start. I'll take the first. I mean, there are really widespread agreement about lots of areas of the UK tax system that are more distortionary, more complicated than they need to be, and that depress economic activity. And I think one really interesting paper that came out a couple of weeks ago now was from, it's coordinated by Centax, the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation at Warwick University, but had signatories across the political spectrum from think tanks setting out 7 areas of the tax system that they all agreed could be made better in a similar way. So this is not really a party political area of difference. There are quite a few areas where there is broad political agreement that actually the current tax system is too complicated. It's more distortionary than it needs to. I think what that means is that you could, as a government, if your objective is economic growth, there are quite a few areas that you could look to reform the current system in a way that would raise you just as much money as you're raising at the moment, but doing less to discourage and distort economic activity. So giving you a growth dividend while at the same time not costing you money on tax, basically. Or if you were looking to raise tax, you could basically do so without depressing economic growth if you were doing that alongside tax reform. I mean, some of those areas are things like properly reforming our property tax system, dealing with the distortions in the VAT system. I mean, we would, as economists, we would all love a much lower VAT threshold so that small businesses aren't discouraged from growing when they hit turnover of £85,000. Charging VAT at the same rate on everything, so we don't have silly court cases like the current one arguing about whether giant marshmallows should be taxed as confectionery, like regular sized marshmallows because you eat them, or whether they should be taxed at a 0 rate like mini marshmallows because those are things that you put in ingredients in cooking. That's all completely silly and a complete waste of economic activity. So there are lots of different areas. So I suppose for me, a government with a tax strategy would say, these are the areas of the tax system that we think at the moment are too complicated, too distortionary. They're not delivering the kind of economic outcomes that we want. And our objective is to move in this direction in these areas. That doesn't mean you have to do that all immediately. And I think lots of these areas, you definitely need to build a public understanding about what's the problem and why you making changes in those areas, but would at least give a sense of a direction of travel so that people can predict where you're going to go in the next few budgets.
I can just hear in my head Paul Johnson shouting about Jaffa cakes and that at the moment.
Yes, exactly.
Jonathan?
So I mean, I think, you know, I basically agree with Gemma that, you know, there's a lot of consensus among economists about what the problems are, and you just need a government that has the sort of political will and long-term vision to do something about it. Most of this stuff is not really rocket science from an economics point of view, although it may sadly be rocket science from a political point of view. But you know, some people say, "Oh, yeah, well, governments never do this thing," you know, because they're always too short. I mean, you know, it was a long, long time ago that Jill and I were doing tax policy in the Treasury, but we did then have actually chancellors who were genuinely interested in making the tax system simpler and more efficient. And it did happen, and it would be nice to get back to that.
So, I mean, two things then, I suppose. I mean, firstly, Jonathan, you touched on what they're doing with this council tax surcharge.
Well, yeah, so this is a good example.
Would you like to flesh that out a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so the council, there's the system of council tax and stamp duty together, managed to be both economically extremely inefficient because stamp duty discourages mobility, very regressive at some level because council tax is charged, at the same rate on Buckingham Palace or whatever as a 2-bedroom in Darlington. But also very progressive in a badly designed way at the upper end, because you have these very, very large charges for high value properties, which actually really add quite a lot to the transaction cost of selling. And I've heard anecdotally from some people who I won't name that this is that they really quite resent this sort of imposition. When they, for example, sell a very expensive house in Oxford and buy a very expensive flat in London. And, some people do that.
That clearly won't be the clip we use from this.
And so what does the government do? And what do most other countries do? Well, most other advanced economies, and this is not rocket science, right, tend to levy at a local level a flat rate percentage charge on the value of your property, 0.2, 0.3, 0.5% of the value of your property within some sort of banding or approximate system. And that's sort of, seems pretty obvious, right? Again, it's not rocket science, flat rate charge. You could make it a little bit progressive if you wanted to without introducing too much distortion. So what does the government here do? Does it move in that direction? Hell no. Instead, it makes the system more complicated at the upper end by introducing a sort of supercharge levied at a national level on very expensive houses in a way that creates a bunch of cliff edges, further distortions and disincentives, does make the council tax system itself a bit more progressive, which is a good thing, I guess, but at the cost of further complication and doing nothing to address the complications and distortions and disincentives that exist in the current system. And it does really, make you want to go and bang your head against the wall a bit.
I mean, Jill, if there is, as Gemma was suggesting, broad consensus across political parties about the need to do some serious tax reform, why don't governments do it? Why won't governments do it?
Well, I was at a very interesting event at the Labour Party conference where I was on a panel with Tim Loynig and two youngish, newly elected Labour MPs, and we're all talking about sensible reforms, exactly the sort of list that was in the cross-party think tanks saying property, ironing out some of the distortion of the income tax system, etc. And so we're all going on about this. There was huge consensus in the room. And then the politicians turned to Tim Loynig and I and say, so why don't there's all this consensus, why don't the civil servants let ministers do this? And Tim and I sort of went, what? This is all because people are terrified of the politics. Because the one thing is absolutely drummed into you in the Treasury is that losers make much more noise than winners. I mean, particularly where the loss is very specific and visited on someone who is a loser of a very specific targeted relief, some of those things that cause distortion, and the winners are just taxpayers in general. So the gain is much, much more disparate. The big winner is the British economy, having a more efficient and less distorted tax system. But every specific relief has a sort of lobby lined up behind it. And that's one reason why ministers do it. That's one reason why people say, actually, doing some really big reforms is potentially much easier than just taking out things. So people sort of would say George Osborne found it much easier. I think Rupert Harrison was saying this the other night. George Osborne didn't get much blowback for raising the VAT rate generally. he did get huge problems over taking out pasties and going to war with Greggs. This is all about you, this session, Anand. Anyway, your favourite baked goods outlet. And Greggs' share price.
I feel we're revealing too many of my secrets today.
Greggs' share price, sort of, you could see it move, depending on where the debate on the pasty tax was going then. What, of course, is interesting is that George Osborne just raised the rate. He didn't do what economists like Gemma would say do, the thing that got Nick Stern banished from the Treasury effectively, which is to say, take out the zero rates. Other countries don't have massive zero rates apart from the Republic of Ireland. Take out the zero rates and let's just have a revenue neutral on everything, and let's compensate families who are genuine losers from that by raising child benefit, you see child credits or whatever, and you can compensate people much more directly and not have this sort of stupid distortive tax system, and lots of Treasury officials are super scarred by having to write letters to the parents of oversized children who have to pay VAT on their children's clothes because they're slightly too big to qualify for the clothes that allegedly don't have VAT on them. So it's a real nightmare. I thought actually if I was paying for the child tax changes, the 2-child limit, I was hoping against hope that Rachel Reeves would take out 2 of my bête noirs in tax system, which is the VAT zero rates on children's clothes and children's shoes, which would have paid for a really good chunk of that, because those disproportionately help people who spend loads of money on expensive clothes for their kids at the expense of people who buy their clothes in charity shops, hand-me-downs and things like that. And there are much better ways of doing things, whatever. But I think there's a question about, if we had the courage to do some big reforms early in a parliament, could you do it? And you have to be convinced enough and take the short run unpopularity, because you actually think that you are going to be able to point back in a couple of years' time and say, look, that's a much better system, isn't it? And I think there were some hopes that actually Rachel Reeves, being an economist herself with a giant majority, might have actually done some of that last year, and she didn't. This was probably her last chance to do it, which is why I think the sort of disappointment is quite widespread here now. If you're going to be that unpopular, be unpopular, for a reason. Misquoting Gordon Brown.
Ben, you were nodding along to quite a lot of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you want to hear more from Jill and many other experts on this, I'd recommend the podcast that I've just done on BBC Radio 4 called The Tax Conundrum, where we get into this real issue of the political economy of tax reform and what's blocking it. And as Jill said, what really comes across from all the people we spoke to in that is this issue of the winners and the losers. The losers shout very loudly indeed, and the winners don't, and that's a real block. The other thing that came across to me was the role of the media. I know I'm part of the media, but I do think we have a better job to do of explaining the system. But I suppose the most depressing, in a way, finding of that documentary series was the public. The public have a very distorted view of the way the tax system works. There's a lot of illusions about it. And I'm not blaming the public, but just to Gemma's point, you really need politicians who are prepared and able to go out and make the case and convince people why it will make them better off in the long run. Without that, you're going to get what we have had, which is politicians shying away from it, allowing the system to get more complicated, doing last minute patches that just further complicate it, like Jonathan was saying on council tax, don't address the issue. You need to really go out and make the case, because unless you do that, I think we're going to remain stuck in this really damaging doom loop on taxes.
Interesting. One thing I couldn't quite get my head around was she talked a lot in her speech about how one of the priorities of the budget was to properly fund the NHS. But I couldn't detect much about the NHS in the budget, which was I just missing something? Or was she talking overall when she said this, that the NHS is one of our priorities? Because they're not, by comparative standards, pouring loads of money into the NHS, are they? They don't seem to have a reform plan apart from talking about AI every now and again. I mean, what did the budget have to say about the NHS?
Well, not a lot, but just, I mean, my impression, Anand, was that fits in with the sort of the retail orientation of this budget. So obviously you had the cutting inflation in the NHS and then the controlling debt, but that's sort of explaining why they've gone for more headroom. It was a sort of retrenchment, felt like a political retrenchment budget, which is going, what do people like? They like the NHS. What do people like? Lowering the cost of living. So you're right, there wasn't anything on, they didn't change the spending review envelope for the NHS. There wasn't really much in it at all about the NHS, but felt like they were trying to say, we feel your frustration, we feel your priorities, and that's why we were doing what we're doing.
I think there was a relatively small new announcement on neighbourhood health centres alongside the budget. So the idea here is taking more care into the community. The theory of change of why that helps with their headline target of NHS waiting lists is to try and deal with problems in the community, stop people needing to go and seek hospital treatment. But you're right, Alan, I think for all the rhetoric that this was one of the 3 top priorities for this budget, there wasn't a huge amount of new information on what they were actually doing on the NHS.
I want to come back to what Ben said, and in a way was implied by what Gemma said about the politics of this and retrenchment, and how the politics of the political economy of this budget play out. But first, I mean, let's just talk briefly about Brexit, because of course all the Lib Dem spokespeople I've heard out on the airwaves around this were saying, well, she wouldn't need to raise taxes if she just signed this customs union, this bespoke, wonderful, excellent customs union that we're proposing with the European Union. And this in a week when we've just seen the publication of a paper that seems to revise the cost of Brexit upward from where the OBR had it. I mean, is this a trick that the government's missing? Could and should the government be more ambitious in terms of Brexit, and could they negotiate this sort of deal, and would it make an immediate economic difference? Jonathan, you're unmuted.
Well, I mean, you know more than any of us, frankly, about how realistic it would be to make progress in negotiating with the EU at the moment. But based on what you said, I do not get the impression that the EU collectively is in the market for some sort of ambitious further deal that would be anything like politically viable in the UK. I may be wrong about this, but or you may be wrong about this, but that doesn't seem to be the way in which they've approached the implementation of the sort of outline deal that where the reset hasn't been to say, oh, we do need to do this as quickly as possible and constructively and then go further, as opposed to say, right, we're going to grind out the negotiations in the usual tedious way and make you sweat over every line and every penny in the budget. So that doesn't augur well for some sort of ambitious offer on the part of the UK in the short term. And also, I suspect that if we tried to go for anything that really looked very ambitious, like a proper, that would really move the dial materially in economic terms, in other words, a proper, a customs union that was entrenched, legally binding on both sides, and was built to last, and some similar action on the single market, Europeans, I suspect, would look at it and say, well, can we really be sure that this would last, given that this government doesn't seem to be in a particularly strong political position, and we may be dealing with some other political complexion of the UK post-election, which is not that far away in terms of what these negotiations would be doing. So it's hard to be sort of optimistic that that's realistic. On the other hand, as you say, the paper that came out last week doesn't, I think, sort of transform our understanding of the economic impacts of Brexit, but it is probably the most rigorous and hardest evidence at a microeconomic level, at a sort of company and firm level, of the damage that's been done by Brexit. And it does suggest that you could quibble with the specific point estimates, and I do myself, but I think you do have to look at it and say this is pretty hard and conclusive evidence that the impact of Brexit has been at least as damaging as the OBR predicted.
Yeah.
I mean, the OBR didn't change its assessment. It's ever since the referendum, it's been saying 4%, and it's stuck at 4%. So it didn't revise its view in the light of the paper Jonathan was citing. But just a couple of things. I think, the interesting thing about the way the EU is approaching these negotiations now, they've pocketed the fish extension in the common understanding, or in advance of the common understanding, is that they still seem to be approaching the UK in a sort of zero-sum game. The UK is a demandeur. They're not sort of saying, actually, there are big benefits to both of us, and the European economy is looking pretty sluggish and sickly too, if we actually made it easier for both sides to trade more. So the UK is still in a demandeur. We've seen these rows going on about the thing that was supposed to be concluded very quickly on defence, about how big is the UK contribution going to be, and quite a mercantilist approach still from our friends across the channel in terms of the French. So and as Jonathan says, it's not that appealing to the EU to devote huge amounts of time and effort to doing stuff with the UK if it's about to be completely torn up by an incoming reform/conservative government. So how much. The other thing, though, I think is, particularly look at the micro level data, is that it's much easier to destroy trading relationships than to build them back up. It's a sort of one-off decision to say, actually, it's now very difficult to send, to include the UK in my supply chain, so I will now use a different supplier. Than say, actually, I've now built a relationship with this supplier. The UK is now back and available. UK offer would have to be a lot better, I think, to get people to go. So I think there's some asymmetry. So I don't think you can just sort of say the estimates are that Brexit has knocked this much off GDP and just say, and so if we immediately did this deal, that would be an extra 4%, whatever the numbers are, it's not quite 4% and stuff for the sums, but it would immediately restore all of that. I think it would be quite a slow road back, potentially.
And also, going back to what you said about concentrated costs and diffuse benefits, the current situation will have a bunch of sort of private sector actors who are doing quite well out of it. It might be, European firms that have replaced UK firms in supply chains and stuff, who actually don't want to see us rubbing away the frictions because they quite like the new situation. So there's always going to be a degree of political pressure on European governments. It also strikes me that the more frequently government ministers here stand up and go on about how wonderful their new trade deals are, the harder politically they're making it for themselves to go and do a customs union down the line. Because of course,
I think one of the things that's been really, I think, slightly unexpected about this Labour government is that it's frankly shown sort of Liz Truss-like enthusiasm for trade deals. It's not negotiated quite as bad deals as Liz Truss. They aren't quite in the Boris Johnson tactic of setting a date for the photo opportunity and then having to basically sign whatever the Australians presented them with. But they are as enthusiastic about bilateral trade deals. I mean, that was one of the arguments about the OBR scoring. It was, why didn't they score the benefits of the India trade deal? Look at the government's own assessment of the benefit of the India trade deal, and it's 0.13% of GDP after 10 years. So frankly, that's not moving the dial massively economically, so which is quite interesting. But they do seem very enthusiastic and keen on that. And I actually bumped into somebody who was training trade negotiators today, who said that whereas the strategy seemed to have shifted under new management, that new management were very keen to do lots of big blocky trade deals, whereas under Jonathan Reynolds and Douglas Alexander, the government was actually keener on doing these sort of little bitty, maybe less slightly Instagrammable agreements in very specific sectors. So she said it's easier to trumpet a deal with Mercosur than something about pig semen, was the example she gave.
Yeah, and it was interesting that Rachel Reeves forefronted the trade deals in her speech yesterday, saying this government has achieved major trade deals. Sorry, Ben, you've been patiently unmuted.
Just a macro point. The OBR put out an annex or another document explaining why it had reduced its trend productivity growth forecast for the UK, and I was surprised actually how much emphasis it put on trade as a negative relative to its previous stock take of UK growth potential. And the way that Rachel Reeves had talked leading up to the budget, one had got the impression that the OBR was about to say that it had downgraded it because Brexit was worse, the impact of Brexit was worse than previously thought. So I thought, oh, maybe that NBER paper had been seen by the OBR and had affected its judgment. But as Jill said, no, it wasn't. Actually, they're sticking to their overall view, which they've had since 2020 on Brexit, of a 4% GDP productivity hit. So that's not the reason why they've knocked 0.3 percentage points off the long-term growth rate potential productivity for the UK. But they do mention what Donald Trump has done as a contributor. Just a more closed economy for a very open, a more closed global economy will negatively impact a very open economy like the UK. And that's notwithstanding all the trade deals and all the other things like that. They just think the outlook is more inhospitable to the UK in a world in which trade barriers are rising, albeit that they're going up and down because of the volatility of Donald Trump. And I thought that was quite...
As far as I'm aware, we don't know where that line from Rachel Reeves came from, that the impact of Brexit has been worse than we initially thought. I don't know where that statement came from. Gemma, do you want to add anything on this? On the B word?
No, I think you guys are much more expert than me on the B word.
I mean, just finally on the politics of this. I mean, there are several interesting things. I mean, in my experience, most governments sort of front load pain so that as you get closer to the general election, you can sort of relax things a bit, maybe give some tax cuts. It strikes me this government's doing the opposite. Now, there's been a lot of maybe cynical takes on this, saying this is basically about Reeves and Starmer's short-term political survival, so they had to front load the good sounding stuff and backload the more negative stuff. But I suppose from that comes two questions to all of you. I mean, first is that a fair assessment? And secondly, given the way our politics works, do we really think it's feasible that some of those tough things they're going to have to do a year before a general election, we really think they're going to be able to do them in that context?
I think it's fair to say that this looks like a package of measures that is giving money away in the short term and leaving all of the tax rising and cuts to the end of the Parliament. You can sort of see some reasons for that. So the big tax rise was the continuation of the threshold freezes of income tax and national insurance. And by definition, they were already being frozen for several years. So adding on the freeze happens by definition at the end of the period. But that's still sort of further squeeze on people's incomes, more people being dragged into higher tax brackets as you get close to the next election. So that could definitely backfire politically. And with some of the newer taxes, like the high property value tax and the EV charging, I think it's going to take them time to figure out how they're going to do that and to do the property revaluations. And that's part of what's also driving the delay of those. But again, that's going to mean people in those high value properties getting that bill for the first time for £2,500 or £4,500 pretty close to the next election, which also looks a bit challenging. I think we haven't talked a lot about what they've done on spending, but one of the ways that they've saved a few £1 billion in this forecast to help rebuild their headroom against the fiscal rules is by penciling in basically a freeze in public service spending in the year beyond the current spending review period. And this feels very much like a bit of a return to the behaviour we saw under previous governments of penciling in unspecified spending squeezes far out. And then certainly what we've seen in the last 5 years or so is that when it comes to the crunch and the government actually gets to the point of having to put some detail behind those numbers, they've always ended up topping up those plans. So I think particularly on the spending side, there is a real danger that when we get to that point in 2029, that they will not actually be able to come up with a set of plans that are consistent with that low level of spending, and they'll end up wanting to spend more.
Interesting. Jonathan, you're nodding.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree entirely with Gemma. The sort of big risk here is that this is storing up a pre-election squeeze, particularly on the spending side, which history and common sense both suggest it's going to be difficult to impossible to deliver. And it seems that the government's hope is a combination both, it's that something will turn up, whether that's growth or something else that somehow gets them out of this hole. But that, I think, is a pretty so while I think the measures are and tax and fiscal terms are defensible in the short term, there are going to be some difficult bullets to bite in the year or two before the election, and that's a bit of a big concern.
Ben?
Nothing to add really, apart from the fact that there really is obviously a lot of latent pent-up spending pressure on the government, which I don't think that they have fully faced up to. I think the idea, as you've been hearing, that you can impose real-term cuts on unprotected departments in the years before the Parliament, before the next election, just don't feel very credible. It feels like we're still caught between two stools in terms of taxes, although they are reaching as the OBR stressed, a record high to provide the kind of public services and welfare provision that British people clearly collectively want. It will need to go higher still. That's the lesson I draw from it.
Jill, you get the final word.
I think Reeves and Starmer basically decided that the budget would be there to try to give them a fighting chance of being the people being forced to make those decisions at the back end of this Parliament, because if they hadn't served up something quite palatable now, there was quite a risk that they wouldn't be around to even have that option.
Okay, interesting. Well, listen, thank you all as ever. You've actually made me understand a little bit about this budget, which is no mean feat. Whilst we're only doing one fiscal event a year, I do hope you'll join us again, you four, in the spring, maybe around the time of the OBR forecast, just to sort of touch base on where we are, even if there isn't a formal fiscal event to talk about. Thank you all for joining. A particular thanks to those who've been texting to say I look like a tech bro, which I take as a compliment, though clearly it wasn't intended as such. And we will see you again soon at our next event. So